Okay, kids, here we are. This is our big Thursday. Now this is, as you know, today is the day before the 50th anniversary of the killing of the president. I leave after this class to go to Dallas, where I'm going to be delivering one of the keynote addresses to the major gathering that is there just off Daley Plaza. We've been still in a major war with the city as to whether or not anyone is going to be allowed to mention the assassination itself. Because they have, as I told you before, they've reserved the entire Daley Plaza and all the blocks around it for a commemoration of Dallas Loves JFK. Complete with a flyover by the Blue Angels. But there's the permit that they received prohibits anybody from mentioning the assassination or displaying any type of sign or anything else, including a t-shirt, that mentions the assassination. So we don't know yet exactly how confrontational this is going to be, but I'm scheduled to deliver the keynote address, and it doesn't make that much difference to me where I do it, so that's getting ready to happen. Okay, so what I want to do here before we start today is I want to have a couple amendments to some things that we said before that I had in 2 lectures ago I had referred to David Sanchez Morales as the Mexican, and the fact is that he lived for a long time in Cuba, bless you. But the fact is he was a Mexican, and his nickname was the Indian, as distinct from his being Cuban and his nickname being the Mexican. That's just so we'll stay accurate throughout this. And also in the famous June 21st 18.5-minute gap on the tapes, the White House tapes, that I misspoke when I was talking about it, that was Haldeman that was actually in the meeting, having the meeting with Nixon when the 18.5-minute gap occurred. It wasn't John Dean. Okay, so just that's a little bit of housekeeping. Now, one more piece of housekeeping before we start here, because once we get started on these things, they start to kind of have their own energy. So what I want to check is, as you know, next week is Thanksgiving week. Just like when we experienced the assassination of the president, which is the very week before Turkey Day. And so I know that a lot of you have to get rides and to get home in time for Thanksgiving or flights or things like that. And what I want to know is, I'm not going to ask people to raise their hands if you're not going to be here. But I would like to have you raise your hand if you know that you are going to be here on Tuesday, because I'm trying to figure out how important that discussion is going to be. So get them way up so I can see them. How we're going to do? We're doing okay. So we've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16. So I got about 16 out of the 30. So that means that we're going to be about half of us here. I appreciate that, and I'm not going to memorize you that aren't coming. But I will notice you're not here on Tuesday. No, I won't do that. But what I want to do is I don't want to begin an extraordinarily important set of lectures on Tuesday with only half of you here. So what I want to do is I want to try to figure out whether we should postpone into the following week and that following 2 days, the Tuesday and Thursday that we have together on December 3rd and December 5th, the kind of presentations that I need to make. But I didn't like it last time when we had to do the 2 plenaries right back to back on Thursday. It was way too much like taking a drink out of a fire hose. And I had to kind of rush through each of those scenarios, and I could see from the kind of size of your eyes as I was doing all of that this was kind of a heavy dose. And that's why I came back the following Tuesday and kind of redid a lot of that for you. So I don't want to have to do that again. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to do a transitional presentation on Tuesday for those of you who are going to be here. It will be videotaped, and we'll make sure that all of you can get to see it, so that you'll see it. But you just won't be here to participate in the conversation about it. So what I'm going to do today is I want us to remember that as of now we have in fact covered 6 of the 8 notes, as it were, that are in this octave. I told you before that there's an entire octave of different theories of the assassination of the president. There's a great effort on the part of the mainstream media to convince you that there are only basically 2 positions. One is that Lee Harvey Oswald did it acting completely alone as the lone deranged gunman. And then there's all the rest of the crazy conspiracy theories, of which there are myriad. That's their general position, and that they usually pick the craziest ones they can think of as examples of those other. But the fact is, as we discussed at some length in the early classes, there's a reason why the human family basically ends up manifesting ourselves in the form of an octave with regard to these major public policy disputes that take place, because there is an entire octave of worldviews, human worldviews, and that people tend to perceive major events like this through the prism of their worldview. And so we've covered so far the Lee Harvey Oswald as the lone deranged gunman. We've covered the Lee Harvey Oswald, according to Jim Garrison, operating as an agent of this kind of deranged group of weirdos in New Orleans, these kind of gay, anti-communist, crazy right-wingers with Clay Shaw and David Ferry and a bunch of these kind of weirdos. When you watch the movie JFK, you can see how bizarre and crazy they make those people appear. So there's that one. And then we've covered the House Select Committee on Assassinations theory of G. Robert Blakey, that the mob did it. That the mob did it because they were angry at John Kennedy and Robert Kennedy for mounting this kind of major aggressive campaign against organized crime, which they viewed as kind of a betrayal of an assumption that Kennedys weren't going to harass them too much for being organized crime people, because Joseph Kennedy had been one of them. And then what we did is we opened last week onto the fourth one, which was the S-Force. This S-Force of the 15 anti-Castro Cubans who had been put together to assassinate Fidel Castro had somehow turned in a 180-degree arc and killed the president because he had shut down their bases and had actually sent in helicopter gunships and burnt them out and arrested a number of them. And so that they, having a semi-autonomous capacity to commit assassinations, had done a 180-degree turn and had gone and killed him in retaliation against that. And then we had we opened on to the 5th issue this last Tuesday, and that being that there was in fact a rogue element inside the Central Intelligence Agency. People like E. Howard Hunt and Frank Sturgis and Maurice Bishop, who was David Atlee Phillips, the people that had basically gone native with the Cubans. And they and the S-Force together had killed the president. And we had then crossed a major important line at the end of the discussion last Tuesday, when we came to the theory that the Central Intelligence Agency as an institution had actually killed the president. That all the way the top ranking members of the Central Intelligence Agency had all decided to kill the president because of some bureaucratic imperative, that the Central Intelligence Agency itself was in danger, that the president was going to shatter it into 1,000 pieces and scatter it to the winds, and that therefore this major institution, sort of like HAL, you know, in 2001, had gotten the impression that it was going to be shut down. And so what they did is they used their not inconsiderable skills to assassinate the president. to stop themselves from being destroyed. But that was where we had gotten to at the end of Tuesday. What I want to do today is I want to get to the seventh note, as it were, in this particular octave, and this is the theory that Oliver Stone wove into and supplemented the crazy group of homosexuals in New Orleans killed the president theory, where he feathered into that the understanding from Fletcher Prouty that's set forth in The Secret Team, written by L. Fletcher Prouty, who I mentioned to you was the liaison between the Joint Special Operations Agency of the Pentagon and the CIA. And that this guy was in a very high position to know about these things. And he's the character that was woven into the script by Oliver Stone, played by Donald Sutherland, that Mr. X, who met Kevin Costner on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial, and then sat down with him in the park and kind of explained how it was that it was this other group of people. And so that I want to focus on that here, because this is a theory. The seventh theory in the octave is a theory that this went actually beyond simply the Central Intelligence Agency. That this was not just the Central Intelligence Agency responding because it as an institution was threatened, and that they therefore retaliated against this individual president and eliminated him to save the bureaucracy. What Fletcher Prouty was saying, what he was saying in his book called The Secret Team, what he was saying in his additional book called JFK, Vietnam, and the Death of the President, this is a much larger theory. What he is asserting here is that this was basically an assassination by consensus. That the entire military industrial command of the Joint Chiefs, the CIA, the FBI, all of the people that were responsible within the government, and this is important to remember, this theory, this seventh theory, is that the entire established community inside the United States government that was responsible for the national defense and the defense of our country had decided by consensus that the president had to be killed because he had taken this turn against the interest of the country, not just against the bureaucratic interests of the CIA, but because of the interests of the entire country, to continue to be protected with the most powerful nuclear arsenal in the world, with the most aggressive military in the world that was based in literally hundreds of military bases all around the world. That it was clear that President Kennedy had decided, following the Cuban Missile Crisis and the near total catastrophe that represented, that he had turned and was deciding to disassemble this entire monolith of power that the United States had developed basically since the late 1890s, when it decided to become a major imperial power in the world. And so that what we want to examine here, what it is that Fletcher Prouty is saying, and what was said also by Jim Mars in the book Crossfire, which you'll note that in the movie, the JFK movie, it says that the movie script is based upon the book by Jim Garrison on the Trail of the Assassins, and also Jim Mars' Crossfire. It doesn't mention Fletcher Prouty because at that time he didn't tell who Fletcher Prouty was. He had him be Mr. X, and so he didn't disclose that Fletcher Prouty was the source of all of this for him. But it's important to see here what was happening. Now, we remember that in Brothers, and in some of the other books that you've read, you'll remember that there was this extraordinary degree of hostility going on between President Kennedy and the Joint Chiefs. That the Joint Chiefs had, as I mentioned earlier, they had actually programs that were functioning out in the various military services, actually propagandizing people in those military services, giving them information from the John Birch Society, characterizing liberals as basically being synonymous with communists, that our country was basically under threat, that there were communists inside the State Department, there were communists throughout the government, and that there was this momentum that was underway among the military. And that the ranking members of the Joint Chiefs of Staff were extremely protective about the very conservative, indeed kind of reactionary worldview that they had. And that they viewed President Kennedy to be, in a sense, not only a spineless coward and a sniveling little brat, as Curtis LeMay recounted to Fletcher Neville when he was being interviewed, but they actually have gone so far as to perceive John Kennedy as a traitor, an actual traitor, that because he was engaged in not only opening a backdoor channel to Castro to normalize relations with Cuba, and thereby to allow Cuba to remain a bastion of communism in Latin America, and therefore a springboard for communist infiltration into the other governments all throughout Central and South America. But he had also opened this backdoor channel of communications with Khrushchev that he actually had, I've mentioned before, these 18 private letters that were being exchanged with Khrushchev outside of any official diplomatic channels. So that he was basically being perceived as almost engaged in a secret drop, like one would to spies. You know, like here, put an X on the mailbox and drop a set of secret documents for me. But he was the President of the United States, and he was in a position to actually start negotiating to eliminate the entire nuclear arsenal of the United States that had been developed since the end of World War II all the way up until 1960, that entire 15-year period that we developed this nuclear armament that made us the power of the world. And so what Fletcher Prouty is saying, Fletcher Prouty actually asserts in his book, both books in fact, that it was this group that killed the president. It wasn't just the S-Force. Well, you start out the very first thing. It wasn't just Lee Harvey Oswald. It was Lee Harvey Oswald functioning in the context of the S-Force. And it wasn't just the S-Force. It was, in fact, this rogue element within the Central Intelligence Agency, their handlers that were working with them that had gone native. Indeed, it was actually the Central Intelligence Agency as a whole, for its own institutional reasons, retaliating against the president. But in fact, those were just instrumentalities. They were the instrumentalities because they happened to have the honed expertise to actually carry out political assassinations. But what is being asserted by Fletcher Prouty and was implied by the JFK movie, that the Joint Chiefs of Staff and the FBI and even Lyndon Johnson and the Southern kind of conservatives all banded together, and that there was a consensus that the president had to be killed because he was engaged in acts of treason. And of course they would very immediately tell themselves that this isn't something that one could really reveal to the American public. One couldn't actually impeach him for being a traitor because it was too mortifying to tell the American people that the President of the United States was not only a traitor, but in fact he was a moral degenerate, which was basically the information, one could almost even call it knowledge, on the part of J. Edgar Hoover about the activities of President Kennedy. And so they had developed a collective view that ranged all the way from being a spineless coward and a sniveling little brat who had been brought into the office by his wealthy criminal father, all the way to the fact that he was a moral degenerate, you know, engaged in sexual intercourse with virtually all of the interns, in having them swim nude with him in the White House swimming pool. And he was a total absolute hypocrite because he was constantly posing with Jackie and their sweet little children. At the same time, he was running around doing all of these degenerate things. So they had actually convinced themselves that somehow the presidency had been occupied by a sniveling, cowardly, degenerate, traitor. You know, and the question is, you know, how many descriptions do you need to have of a guy before you kill him? If that's what you do, you know? And it's important to remember that this is what those people do. There's an old CIA guy who told me the story, a famous story of the CIA, said that it's a story about this little old Russian lady that was up on the steppes of Russia in the midst of the winter, and it was freezing cold, and the wind was blowing sideways, and it was like 35 degrees below zero, and she had to go outside of her little cabin and cut some wood to bring in for her stove, and she goes out and she's cutting some wood and she sees a snake lying there that's frozen solid. And so she feels very sympathetic about the poor thing. She picks up the snake and she brings him inside, and right next to the fireplace, she builds the fire, she puts the snake by the fire, and the snake starts thawing out and thawing out. She starts to wiggle a little bit, and she reaches down and she strokes him like this, and the snake turns around and bites her in the hand. And she's completely shocked, and she said, "This is outrageous. You know, you were out there frozen, and I saved your life. I bring you in here, I put you by the fireplace, I get you warm, I thaw you out, and I saved your life, and you bite me in the hand." And the snake looks up at her and says, "Well, gee, lady, that's what snakes do." That's a very famous story inside the Central Intelligence Agency. And so the question becomes, that people who are trained by both political parties, by virtually all the major structural institutions in the country, who are trained for their entire lives, these guys that are in the military, and they rise all the way to the head of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and people that are inside the Central Intelligence Agency, people who fought with the OSS, they fought in World War II, they've been engaged in World War II in the deaths of hundreds and hundreds of people, each individual, some of them many more, with Curtis LeMay, killing thousands of people at a time in the major strategic bombings, etc. And the CIA that are in fact engaged in numerous assassinations around the world. And so what you've got to understand is that they have a different attitude about the taking of life. Taking of life is an instrumentality. It is something that is done, and it's done for nationalistic purposes. Because you've got to understand that these guys had formed an opinion that was as patriotic as you can imagine. That they had a firm belief, many of these people, that the President of the United States, a moral degenerate and a coward, had basically blinked in the face of the Soviets, threatening them by putting missiles just 90 miles from our shoreline that could have destroyed, you know, millions of American citizens. And in fact, he blinked and he gave in, and he agreed to start disassembling our missiles, not only in Turkey, but was actually engaged in an active conversation about disassembling all of our missiles. And it would logically follow then abandoning the extensive empire that the United States had built, backed by those nuclear weapons and the largest military, in the history of the United States. That he would begin to start to disassemble that entire enterprise. And it was clear that they had thought that somehow something had happened to Kennedy. That in that whole experience with the Cuban Missile Crisis, that being confronted with nothing more serious than the potential total thermonuclear annihilation of the human family, that he had somehow been traumatized by that. And that he had decided that he was going to take the radical step of backing away, of having the United States back away from this direct confrontation that had developed against the Soviet Union, which had in fact not started simply in 1945 at the end of World War II. This was a confrontation that had been going on ever since 1917, when the Bolsheviks overthrew the Tsars in Russia. That this confrontation had been going on ever since then, because at that time, the United States, subject to the demands of a lot of different elements in the country that we'll talk about later, had actually mobilized a full-scale military foreign expedition and had sent massive amounts of U.S. military power into the Soviet Union, aligned with the White Russians around St. Petersburg and the Tsarists there, to actually attempt to overthrow the Bolshevik government. So this had happened right from the start, that there had been this major dialectical confrontation going on between the Western powers and the Soviet Union. So what we see here is that the way that this, according to Fletcher Neville, according to L. Fletcher Prouty, that this entire team, the secret team that had developed over the period of time to engage in covert activities and to overthrow governments and assassinate people and to take extraordinary measures all out of the public eye, had in fact resolved that the president had to be killed and that they had the capacity to do that, and so that they took the steps to do it. So that's what's being asserted here in the seventh of the octave of these different theories of the assassination of the president. And so this is in a sense, while still within the octave of the alternative worldviews, this is a full, clear note higher than the simple fact that the Central Intelligence Agency, just as an institution, retaliated against the President of the United States to defend the bureaucratic interests of the CIA itself, which itself is a full note higher than just a certain rogue element inside the Central Intelligence Agency, who in fact happened to be experts at assassination and happened to be very deeply involved with the Cubans to try to assassinate Castro. And that of course is an entire full note above the simple fact that the mob killed the president. And because the mob had been working as partners with the CIA in various things, but they had their own unique criminal reasons for wanting to get rid of President Kennedy. And of course that is a full note higher than just the fact that some little group of right-wing Zanos in New Orleans had killed the president because they were engaged in supplying military equipment to the base at Lake Pontchartrain, and that base had been shut down by the president, and so they went ahead and killed him. So what we see here, we see a progression here, moving from the lone gunman acting as a deranged individual on up through all the way to the point where we get to, short of this seventh full note, we get to a position where there was a particular agency that had been uniquely created by the National Security Act of 1947 that as a bureaucracy had retaliated against the president to protect its own self-preservation. We cross into a kind of a different realm here when we actually start to engage the possibility that the entire military complex and the military intelligence complex, the national security state complex of the American government, had by consensus decided to kill the president. So it brings us to an extraordinarily important point here in the course, because it's a thing that the people in the so-called conspiracy community never really come to grips with, and that is, what if they were right? What if they were right? What if it turns out that John Kennedy was dramatically different than the romantic vision that we all have of him? That that he was this swashbuckling kind of knight errant, but that he in fact was what they thought. that he in fact was a fairly weak character. He was sickly. He had all kinds of physical disabilities that he had been concealing from people, that if he'd revealed them, he probably never would have been elected. That he was taking all kinds of pain medications. He in fact was engaged regularly and systematically in engaging in what has to be viewed as being a sexual predator. You know, we're talking about one young 18-year-old woman after another that he would encounter, bringing them into the White House, bringing them right into the bedroom with his and Jackie's bedroom when Jackie was out away somewhere from the White House. In that all the Secret Service people knew about this, that they were helping him procure prostitutes, that he was in fact one of the people he was having an affair with was the mistress of Sam Giancana, who had been introduced to him by Frank Sinatra, and that and Kennedy was hanging out with Frank Sinatra, and you know, who was, everybody knew was very closely tied with the mafia. And so, and his father had been a professional criminal during the Prohibition, had been a major bootlegger, and so here's a view of John Kennedy, which is very troubling for people who are in the conspiracy theory community, who have an idea of championing him as virtually all of the things that were put forth as part of a major PR spiel on the part of the Kennedy administration. And so that what we have to come to grips with here at this particular point of our course is that you have to begin to try to think about what is really unthinkable. You know, that they're constantly talking about, oh, the unthinkable thing. The unthinkable thing is that maybe President Kennedy was actually killed by the CIA or the Joint Chiefs working with them. That isn't the really unthinkable thing. That's been thought about a lot, in fact. What's really unthinkable, is the possibility that they were right. Because what we see has happened here is that because we didn't disassemble our entire thermonuclear warfighting capability, because we didn't in fact normalize our relations with Cuba, what's happened really is a much longer term advantage was gained by the United States, where now, by December 31st of 1991, we have effectively vanquished the Soviet Union, eliminated the Soviet Union as a major threat to our projection of military and imperial power. We've not only that, but in fact, we've basically eventually neutralized Castro to the point where the revolution that was undertaken by the Sandinista in Nicaragua has basically been covertly overthrown. El Salvador, they've not allowed the socialists and communists to take control in El Salvador. They really haven't gotten control in Guatemala. You know, the fact of the matter is, when one is playing the long game, here, one could argue that what was done to Kennedy, if in fact Kennedy was in the process of attempting to disassemble the entire nuclear arsenal and perhaps the bases that were forward projections of U.S. military power in the world, if he had been allowed to continue going forward with that we never would have ended up winning the Cold War. And that the opportunity that we have to actually export democracy, to export democratic capitalism, to do all of those things, that these have been made possible by the people who had the courage to do what was necessary to do. Now, see how bad that feels? See how bad that feels? But it's something that you have to come to grips with, because now you're all grown-ups. And it turns out, what we discovered, the boomers discovered, when we were your age is the world ain't like you were told. The world ain't like you were told. And it isn't even like you've been told since we were told. You know? The world is a lot worse than you think. I can tell you that. I mean, people say to me all the time, how can you possibly be so cheerful and so funny and all those other things? How can you possibly be like that with everything that you know? And the answer is that it is absolutely essential for you to become disillusioned. Nobody likes to be disillusioned, but it's absolutely essential for you to become disillusioned, because if you don't, then you're continuing to be illusioned. And you're never going to be able to make our country what its promises are to the world unless you come to grips with the way things really are. Okay? And so what I want you to do is I want you to consider this possibility that the world, the way it really works in the grown-up world, is such a different world from that which you're told in the undergraduate classes in state universities and even in private schools, in private universities. The world is so different that you have to try to take a look at what it is that happened to President Kennedy from that perspective. And that's what this perspective is. The seventh note on the octave is the striking of that note, is that in fact the president was killed because he should have been. Okay, because the system, the way it was functioning at the time and the way that it may still be functioning doesn't work that way. Let me tell you a story, just so I can make you feel a little bit worse before I make you feel better. When we did the Iran-Contra case, the big famous case of the off-the-shelf enterprise, the enterprise that Ronald Reagan said, oh yes, there may be a group of patriotic Americans helping the Contras down in South America because the Contras are like our founding fathers. They're the patriotic founding fathers that are trying to protect the people of Nicaragua against communist totalitarians in the Sandinista government. And therefore there was this whole group of private volunteer military people, retired guys, working to help the pro-democracy forces in Nicaragua against the communists. That when we investigated them and found out that they were in fact made up of many of the people who'd been fired from the Central Intelligence Agency back in 1977, in the big famous Halloween massacre of 1977, October. 840 men were fired, forced into early retirement by Stansfield Turner, the CIA chief for President Carter. They went out and formed this private enterprise, and that I gotta tell you the story. When I filed I think I may have mentioned this before, but the Monday after I filed the Iran-Contra case down in Florida, I can't remember what I told you this now, but the Monday morning after we filed it at 4:30 in the afternoon on Friday the 28th of May of 1986, I had Bill Taylor file it down in the Southern District of Florida at 4:30. The following Monday morning, at 10 o'clock in the morning, I get a call on the phone at my office in Washington, and it's Judge James Lawrence King, who is the chief judge. He says, hello, Mr. Sheehan, this is James Lawrence King. I am the chief federal judge in Miami, and I have before you the copy of your complaint that you filed last Friday afternoon. And I want to let you know that I put it under seal. And unless you're here in front of me by 2 o'clock this afternoon, down in Miami, in my courtroom, I'm going to enter a summary judgment against your complaint. And so I dashed over, and fortunately I had a suit in the office. So I grabbed it out of the closet, and I put on a suit, and I rush down and get a cab, go out to what was still National Airport then, before it became the Reagan International Airport. And I go down and fly, and get a shuttle, fly all the way down to Miami, get out at the airport and get a cab and rush over to the courthouse. And I come jumping into the courtroom at about 1:45, and here's James Lawrence King, the chief federal judge of the Miami Federal Court, sitting up on the bench, looking at his watch to see if it's 2 o'clock yet. So I come hook sliding in about 1:45, and there he is sitting there. And he says, well, Mr. Sheehan, I'm glad that you made it. He said, what I wanted to do is I wanted to introduce you to the lawyers who are going to be representing the 26 defendants that you named last Friday at 4:30. This is Monday afternoon, the following Monday at 2 o'clock. And here's 26 lawyers sitting there in the courtroom. And he says, here is going to be representing Mr. Rodolfo Calero. The gentleman whom you have alleged in your complaint is the head of the FDN Contras. And here's the attorney that's going to be representing them, is Mr. Anthony Lapham. And I said to myself, Anthony Lapham, why do I know that name? And then I remembered Anthony Lapham was the chief counsel for the Central Intelligence Agency under George Herbert Walker Bush, when he was the director of the CIA from 1975 to 1976. And then Judge King said, moreover, he said, here's the lawyer who's going to be representing Ronald Joseph Martin Jr., who is the head of the Tamiami gun shop here in Miami, who you've alleged in your complaint to be the one providing the false end user certificates for the weapons that are you're alleged being smuggled down to the Contras through the Miami Hollywood Airport. And he said, and he's going to be represented by Mr. Williams here. You may also recognize Mr. Williams' name, because Mr. Williams was the head of the criminal division of the United States Justice Department here in Miami until last Friday afternoon at 5 o'clock. And he has decided to retire and go into private practice representing, he said, and I said, professional criminals, Your Honor, I think is the term you're looking for. And he said, okay, Mr. Sheehan, I've heard about you. He said, and that's why I've got you down here. He said, I wanted you here in front of me because I placed this complaint under seal, and if you so much as mention the existence of this complaint, not only what's in it, but if you so much as mention the existence of it, I will put you in federal prison for 6 months for criminal contempt of this court. And I said, oh, well, that's very interesting. I said, exactly what makes you think you have any authority to do that? He said, well, you may not be familiar with the federal rules of civil procedure down here in our court. And I said, well, I assume they're the same federal civil rules that apply in every other federal court. And I said, which my professor, Shapiro, happened to have drafted, and we happen to have worked with him on those. I said, so I'm aware of these from Harvard Law School. And I said, and I assume you're talking about the provision that authorizes a federal judge to exercise some discretion in protecting a jury. If you have to select a jury to sit on a case, and you don't want the jury to have prior knowledge of this, you can exercise some discretion, but it isn't going to authorize you to do anything like this. He said, well, I just wanted to have you here personally so there wasn't any doubt that you knew what you were being told at this case, and so that you're going to have to accept this. I said, well, I don't accept it, and I don't tend to abide by it. I think I'd let you know that. And I said, but are we done here? And he said, yes, we're done. And so I turned and walked out, right? And so so I leave, and I go back up to Washington, D.C., and now this is I fly up just Tuesday morning now, of knowing we've just filed on Friday, I've been down there Monday, now I come in on the office on Tuesday morning, and I call Russell Hemingway. Russell Hemingway is the head of a thing called the Fund for an Effective Congress. It's a big group in New York City that raises funds. He likes to laugh about this. Raises funds for members of Congress that are liberals, whether they're Republicans or Democrats. So he runs this whole operation. So I call him up because he had been the president of the Fund for Constitutional Government in Washington before I was. So that's how I met him. So I call him up and I tell him what's happened. And he said, look, what I'm going to do is I'm going to call Tip O'Neill. I'll call Tip O'Neill, the Speaker of the House of Representatives, and you go on over to see him and tell him what's happened here. And so I leave the office and I go over to see Tip O'Neill, and I go in and there's Tip. along with his chief of staff, this guy in a wheelchair. We're sitting there talking. So I explained to him what we've got here. I hand him a copy of the complaint and explain it to him. And he said, this is extraordinary. He said, because this stuff, if it's true, if this stuff is true, why then these are impeachable offenses. He said, but, you know, while we control the House of Representatives, the Democratic Party, we don't control the Senate. The Republicans still control the Senate. So until we take back the Senate, possibly this fall, in November, the November elections, this is 1986. This is in the 1st of June or so of 1986. He said, but if we can take back the Senate, then what we can do is we can begin impeachment hearings against these people. So what you ought to do is you ought to go up and see Claiborne Pell. Claiborne Pell is a Democratic senator from Rhode Island, and he is the ranking Democrat on the Senate the Senate Foreign Relations Committee that would have to hold the hearings into this foreign violation. So why don't you go see him? And what you do is you tell him, I'll call ahead, he said, and he'll be waiting for you. You go up and see him, and you tell him that if we win the Senate back, then we'll set up a special select committee to investigate this. And he's going to ask you, who do you think ought to head up that committee? And you tell him, John Kerry. Tell him, John Kerry. He loves John Kerry. Everybody kids him that John Kerry must be his illegitimate son. He loves him so much. He said he thinks he's going to be president someday. Of course, so did John Kerry. And so he said, you just tell him that John Kerry is who you want to head up the committee, and he'll say yes. So I did. I went right up and I saw Claiborne, explained the whole thing to him. We got to that point. I said, John Kerry. He said, great, we'll do this, right? So I leave and I go back to my office, and I get back there. It's now early Tuesday afternoon. And I come in, and my secretary, Patty Austin, she says that she's been my secretary since I was with ACLU, right? And she says, Danny, there's an older gentleman waiting for you. I said, oh really, who is he? She said, well, I don't know. He didn't give me his name. And I said, well, where is he? He said, he's up in your office, waiting for you. So I go upstairs, and here's this guy, maybe 70 years old, sitting there waiting for me in these khaki pants with the big baggy bags, and he's all in mufti. You know, he's looking like he's out of a safari somewhere from Africa, and he's got this bag made out of hemp, right? This like knapsack, and so he says hello to me, and he says, Mr. Sheehan, he said, look, I'd like to talk with you about something. And so I said, okay. So I go and I sit behind my desk, and he's sitting there, and he opens up his little knapsack, and he takes out a copy of the complaint. And he says, I've got a copy of your complaint here that you filed down in Miami last Friday, and I'd like to ask you a couple questions about this. He said, you don't know who I am yet, but I might be able to help you out here. He said, can you tell me, who do you think of your 26 defendants is the most important of all the defendants here? I said, well, that's easy. I said, right here. I pointed at Theodore Shackley. And he said, oh, Theodore Shackley. He said, why do you say that? And I said, well, a lot of people would think it was because Theodore Shackley was in fact the ADDO, the Associate Deputy Director for Operations, the head of covert operations for George H.W. Bush, when he was the DCI, the Director of Central Intelligence, back in 75 and 76. And the fact is that he's now Vice President under Reagan while they're doing this whole enterprise, which is the subject of the lawsuit. And it turns out that he was the Director of Covert Operations, and one of his deputies was Donald P. Gregg in the CIA, who happens to be the former case officer for Felix Rodriguez, who is in fact running the Ilopango airlift operations for the Contras right now. And he looked at me and he said, but that's not the reason? And I said, no, actually, that's not the reason. He said, well, what is the main reason why he's so important? And I said, because Theodore Shackley was the director of the Miami station of the CIA on November 22nd of 1963. And he got up and walked across the room and stuck his hand out and shook my hand and he said, my name is Dick Billings, and I was the chief staff writer for the House Select Committee on Assassinations. And I think you and I can help each other out. Okay? And he says to me, he said, look, there's a guy that you need to meet. Would you be willing to meet somebody tomorrow for lunch that I think you want to talk to? And I said, sure, I'd be willing to do that. So the next day, when he says to me, so where would you want to meet so you'll be comfortable? And I said, well, let's do the Dubliner at the bottom of Capitol Hill. It's right down by my office. So he said, fine. So the next day, 12 o'clock, I walk over to the Dubliner, and there's Dick Billings standing out in front waiting for me. I walk in, and he shakes my hand. I walk in, and there's this other older guy, about 70 years old, sitting in there all by himself. And we walk over, and Dick Billings walks over to the guy, and he says, Dan Sheehan? Joe Smith. Joe Smith, here's Dan Sheehan. So I reach out, shake the guy's hand, and I go, yeah, right, Joe Smith. And he says, no, I get a lot of that. He says, my name is Joseph Burkholder Smith, a name that you should remember. Joseph Burkholder Smith, he said. I was the CIA station chief in Mexico City back in 1973 and 74. He said, when Theodore Shackley was made the head of Western Hemisphere operations for the CIA. And I know Dick because I was at graduate school at Princeton when he was there. And we were talking, and he thought that maybe I should tell you something. I said, okay, what's that? He said, well, when I was the deputy station chief, or when I was the station chief down in Mexico City, a deputy station chief, he said Theodore Shackley was made the head of Western Hemisphere operations, and he took the position that there was a guy named Phil Agee who was writing a book about the CIA. It was called Inside the Company. He said, and that he may have discovered the names of the station chiefs all throughout South America. And so what Shackley did is, using that as his excuse, he removed all of the station chiefs from all of the CIA stations all throughout the Western Hemisphere and put all of his own people in. And he put in a guy by the name of Tom Polgar to be the new station chief in Mexico City. And Tom Polgar comes into my office and he says to me, he says, Joe, I'm not sure whether we're going to be able to leave you on here as the deputy station chief, but there's going to be a guy coming in tomorrow to talk with you. You'll recognize who he is. About 10 o'clock in the morning, and he's going to ask you some questions. Depending on how you answer those questions, that'll really determine whether or not you're going to be left on as the deputy station chief here. And he may even want to take you someplace and introduce you to some other people who may have some questions. And depending on how you answer those questions, that'll have a lot to do with whether you're going to be left on as the deputy here. So the next morning, he says, I'm sitting here talking to Joseph Burkholder Smith, sitting at this little table at the Dubliner Cafe on about the 2nd of June, 1986. And he says to me, he said, next morning, about 10 o'clock in the morning, in walks Nasser Haro. Nasser Haro is the head of the DFS in Mexico, which is like the combination of the CIA and the FBI in Mexico. Extremely reactionary guy. Comes in and he says, hi Joe. He said, look at Polgar, I guess, told you that I've got some questions for you as to whether you're going to be left on here as the deputy. He even said that you might be willing to come and meet with some other people who have some questions. So Joe says, yeah, so I agreed I would. So he takes him out, you go downstairs, they get into one of these smoke windowed little station wagons and take off, and they go to the Mexico airport, Mexico City. They go completely around all the security, get into a Learjet, and fly away. So they fly all the way to Buenos Aires, in Argentina, and they land in Buenos Aires. They get out, and they walk out completely around all the security and get into a helicopter and fly away, he said. They fly all the way up into the northwestern corner of Argentina at this place called Salta. And they land on a soccer field. He said, we land on the soccer field with dust flying everywhere, and we get out of the helicopter, and I follow this Nasser Haro across the soccer field. In Nasser Haro, they walk up this embankment, and I look over the embankment, and I thought I was in Bavaria, he says. He said, so we go up over the bank, we go down into this little, like, Bavarian town, and we walk into this little Bavarian inn, and here are these 6 guys sitting at this big, huge oaken table. And I walk in, and there they are in front of this great big huge stone fireplace, and up above the fireplace on the mantle is a huge swastika flag. See, now this is 1973. And he says, the guy gestured to me to come and sit down, and so there's only one chair on the other side of the table, so I go and sit down, and he says, Joe, there's some questions about whether you're going to be left on as the deputy station chief in Mexico City for the agency. And we wanted to tell you, we've gone to a lot of trouble to create a major cocaine cartel down in Medellin in Colombia. And we're going to be generating lots of cocaine that's going to be going up into the United States. And a portion of the profits from that cocaine sales are going to be used to help finance our war without boundaries against your enemies and ours. And we just wanted to make sure that if you're going to be left on as a deputy, that you aren't going to do anything to interfere with that trafficking. And so he says to me, Joseph Burkholder Smith said to me, and you know, Dan, he said, I swear to God, he said, I don't know what I'd ever done in my whole life that would have led them to believe that I would have gone along with that. And so I said, how about being the deputy CIA station chief in Mexico City for a start? I said, and he got totally kind of offended. And he got up and he turned to Dick Billings and he said, gee, I thought he was going to be cooperative in this. And Dick looked at him and said, hey, look, I just met him. He said, and so he gets up from the table and he walks around to me like this, and he comes over to me like this, and he sticks his hand out to me to shake my hand. He looks me in the eye and he said, I just wanted to make sure that if you're going to do this kind of case, you knew exactly who you were dealing with. Now, what does that mean to you? What does that mean to you?
It's a threat.
What that means is that our United States Central Intelligence Agency was not only deeply in bed with the people who created the cocaine cartel in Medellin, and were knowingly smuggling cocaine into the United States, but these people were Nazis. These people are fascists. These people came right directly from World War II into South America, from Germany, from that Third Reich, and they were there. And they were working in South America with our Central Intelligence Agency. And Theodore Shackley, as it turns out, who was the director of Western Hemisphere operations at that time, was born in Germany. And in fact, had come to the United States before World War II and become a naturalized citizen. And it turns out that he had enlisted in the U.S. Army in World War II and had gone to the 101st Counterintelligence Corps as a German-American translator. And he also knew Polish. So he was in the 101st Counterintelligence Corps. And it turns out at the very end of World War II, at the end of World War II in Europe, VE Day, when the Germans surrendered, turns out that Reinhard Gehlen, who was the Major General in the Third Reich, who was the commander of the entire Third Reich's anti-Soviet and anti-Eastern Bloc intelligence, turned himself in to the 101st Counterintelligence Corps and tried to strike a deal with them. And it turns out the translator that was assigned to him was Theodore Shackley. And Theodore Shackley served as the translator for Reinhard Gehlen when he engaged in a month-long negotiation with the United States, 101st Counterintelligence Corps and the OSS, engaged in a negotiation, came all the way to the United States, went to Fort Hunt outside of Washington, D.C., with Theodore Shackley serving as his translator, and negotiated a deal whereby he, as the head of the Third Reich's anti-Soviet and anti-Eastern Bloc intelligence, was in fact allowed to have his name taken off the Nuremberg War Tribunal list, war criminal tribunals, and those of another 100 men in the Third Reich. And that they would be brought on to serve with him, and he would be made the head of the new West German intelligence department in Germany at the request of the United States. And he did. They took him off the Nuremberg war criminal list and all these 100 men, put him into Berlin, and became the director of anti-Soviet intelligence for the Western NATO nations for 26 years after that. And his deputy was Theodore Shackley. And Theodore Shackley was in the entering class of 1948 of the Central Intelligence Agency. Full-time, trained Central Intelligence Agency, vetted Central Intelligence Agency member, serving as the deputy to Reinhard Gehlen from 1948 all the way through until 1961. Okay? And he was trained at a special academy that was set up by Reinhard Gehlen up in a place called Oberammergau in the Bavarian Mountains at the end of World War II. They set up a special academy called the Anti-Communist Special Warfare Training Academy. And it was run by a guy by the name of Major General Otto Skorzeny, who was in fact the commander of the Nazi Waffen-SS Special Forces. And he ran that academy, and he trained between 1948 and 1965, trained 1,200 men from all the NATO nations, all of the Allied nations that had won the World War II, including Israel. And they were trained there at that academy. And they spread out all across the world into the intelligence services of all of the NATO nations. And these people had a greater loyalty horizontally to each other than they had vertically to the civilian governments for which they were working throughout the world. Okay? And Theodore Shackley was there from 1948. He went to that academy, was a graduate of that academy, and continued to serve as the deputy to Gehlen in Berlin until 1961, when he was brought to the United States and made the CIA station chief of the Miami station, running the S-Force assassination team that was assembled to kill Fidel Castro and the others. Okay? So that what I was told directly by the deputy station chief of the CIA of Mexico City, face to face, person to person, is that we had that alliance with the Nazis at the end of World War II. Okay? So the world doesn't run the way you've been told it does. Okay? Nobody is going to tell you about that. Nobody's going to tell you about that deep, dark secret that resides at the core of the creation of the national security state bureaucracy that was created at the end of World War II. Because it was not a bureaucracy that was simply anti-communist. It was an alliance that was fascist. And it's important for you to know that. There's a big difference between a person being a conservative and a person being a fascist. Fascism is what happened in World War II. And what we're going to talk about when we come together again is what effect did that fascism, that worldview of fascism, have upon the creation of the Central Intelligence Agency and the creation of the other major instrumentalities of the national security state that were established through the National Security Act of 1947. So that when in fact you see things happening through the Central Intelligence Agency and through these other groups, you understand that the credo, the mythos, and the ethos that they are pursuing is not simply anti-communism. It's not simply the effort to defend ourselves against the Bolsheviks who overthrew the Tsar in 1917. This is a fascist element that in fact is in direct alliance with the very people who created and ran the Third Reich. And what you will find out when we get to it is that they are indeed the people who created the Third Reich, financed the Third Reich, paid the money to Hitler to develop the party in Germany to function as the bulwark against Bolshevism in Europe. And so I'm telling you that the world is a very different place than you've been led to believe. Okay? And one of the things that we want to do in this course is we want to be able to assist you in coming to understand what this world is really like. Not so that you'll despair, but so that you won't continue to be illusioned. And so that you'll understand the seriousness that it's going to take to do something about this. Because, I'll tell you the additional part of the story, is that when in fact the Democratic Party won the election in the fall of 1986 and took control of the United States Senate, and they actually went forward and set up the select committee that they promised to with Claiborne Pell. They set up a select committee called the Select Committee on Narcotics and Terrorism. And it was chaired by John Kerry. And it was only months later, after we had spoon-fed information to Kerry about the cocaine smuggling going on out of South America, and the tail numbers on the airplanes where they were smuggling the cocaine and the weapons, and the call numbers that they used to land at the landing sites that we had all of the logistics for. And in fact, we even had the details of the house that they brought the cocaine to in Miami, and the private unlisted telephone number that you call at that house, and the code words that you use to purchase cocaine from them. And I sat in a meeting face to face with the head of the Special Task Force of the DEA, of the Drug Enforcement Agency of the United States federal government, in his office with an old and dear friend of his that he'd known ever since they were together in the Air Force. And I pushed the memo across the table to him, the head of the Special Task Force of the DEA, listing the entire details of the tail numbers and the location of the house and the phone numbers and the code words you use for it. I pushed it across the table to him, and he took it and he read it and he looked up at me and pushed it back to me and said, "Look, Dan, you know what this is, and so do I. I plan to live to see my retirement." And that's what he said to me. Okay? And so I start talking with Russ Hemingway, an old and dear friend of John Kennedy's that was in the Navy with him. And I tell him what's happening here. And he ends up going over to meet with John Kerry, the head of this special select committee. And he calls me, Russ Hemingway calls me on the phone. He said, "Dan, I got to tell you something." He said, "I was just sitting in a meeting with John Kerry, and we were talking about this, and into the room comes Donald Regan, the Democratic senator from Michigan, and comes in and says to John Kerry, John, I need to talk with you right away about something privately." And John Kerry said, "No, that's okay. Russ is fine. Russ is okay. You can talk about anything you want." And so Donald Regan says to him, "Look, I've just been asked by the leadership of the Democratic Party," he said, "to let you know that they've been contacted by the leadership of the Republican Party, and the Republican Party is willing to withdraw its request for $100 million of military aid to the Contras if John Kerry will agree to stand down from this investigation that he's doing about the cocaine trafficking in the anti-terrorist divisions inside the government." And they wanted me to tell you, the leadership of the Democratic Party wanted me to tell you that, look, the Republican Party has also agreed to not only withdraw their request for the $100 million in military funding for the Contras, they've agreed to join in a covert agreement with the Central Intelligence Agency and the Democratic and Republican Party to covertly fund the election of Chamorro, who is running in a Democratic election in Nicaragua against the democratically elected government of the Sandinistas. And we will engage in a CIA covert funding of their opponents in the election if you will get Kerry to drop this investigation. And he said, "But, John," he said, "they wanted to make it clear that the leader of the Democratic Party is telling you that they will, in fact, be it's your choice as to whether to drop this investigation. But if you do decide to drop the investigation, the leadership of the Democratic Party will be very, very, very grateful to you personally in the very near future." And so I said to Russ Hemingway, I said, "What the hell does that mean?" He said, "That means the vice presidential nomination when Al Gore runs for the presidency in the year 2000. That's what he said to me. And I said, "How the hell do you know that?" He said, "Look, Dan, I've been around a long time in this town." He said, "I'm telling you, that's what that means." So he hangs up the phone. And the next morning, I get a call at 9 o'clock in my office from Jonathan Weiner. Jonathan Weiner is the chief counsel for Senator John Kerry's Senate staff. and one of the guys that we've been working with and giving information to pass it along to the Senate Select Committee on Narcotics and Terrorism, right? Jonathan Weiner calls me up and he says, Dan, I've got to talk to you right away. Something very important has happened. And I said, okay, I'll be right on over to the office. And he said, no, not in the office. We can't talk about this in the office. I'll meet you at this other place. And he names this Chinese restaurant for us to go, and for me to meet him on the hill. So I go over and I go up to the hill, and I go into the Chinese restaurant, and there he is. Jonathan Weiner is sitting there waiting for, when I sit down, and Jonathan Weiner says, Dan, something very important has happened. And I said, oh, John, you're not going to tell me about the Rico meeting yesterday, are you? And he said, what? He said, how the hell did you know about that? And I said, how the hell do I know about anything? I said, why is it we're the ones that have to give you all the information? You're the fucking government. I said, I've been spoon feeding you this information about these people in South America. You haven't been doing shit. I said, and he said, well, look, he said, what he said is that if Kerry would drop this investigation, he said that they would be very, very, very grateful to him personally, right in the very near future. And I looked at him and I said, what the hell does that mean? And he says, that means the vice presidential nomination in the year 2000 when Gore runs for the presidency. And he leans across and he puts his hand on my arm and he says, and you and I will be there, Dan. You and I will be there. And I said, fuck you, Jonathan. I said, fuck you and Kerry. I said, I didn't do all this just to be on the vice president's staff. If I wanted to be on the vice president's staff, I would have gone there directly from Harvard Law School, you asshole. I said, I spent 6 years investigating this thing, and we've hand-delivered to you every bit of this thing, put you in this fucking office here, and you're talking about giving me a position on the vice president's staff? Fuck you. And fuck Kerry if he takes this deal. And I got up and walked out.
Good.
What I'm saying to you is the world is a very different place than you've been told. Okay? And John Kerry, who is an absolute horse's ass, who I wouldn't believe if he told me that the sun rose this morning, is our Secretary of State now. Because when it came time to make him the vice presidential nominee, along with Gore, when he ran for the presidency in 2000, pursuant to this promise, that the problem was that Al Gore was so pissed off at Bill Clinton that he wouldn't let Bill Clinton even campaign for him at all. Because Bill Clinton, remember, had lied to Al Gore about the Monica Lewinsky affair. And he'd humiliated Al Gore by telling Al Gore that he gave Al his private personal word. There was nothing to this, that he had nothing to do with this woman. And Al Gore had gone around telling all of his political friends, look, I can give you my word, there's nothing to this Lewinsky thing with Clinton. And Clinton had lied to him. So Al Gore was so mad at him that he wouldn't allow either Bill Clinton or Hillary Clinton to appear at one single public event during his entire campaign for the presidency. And so what he did is when he won the primary, he, in fact, didn't select John Kerry as he was being ordered to as his vice presidential candidate. He picked instead Lieberman, Joe Lieberman from Connecticut, because Joe Lieberman was the only one in the Senate that stood up on the floor of the Senate and condemned Bill Clinton for lying to all of his friends. And so Al Gore picked Lieberman to be his vice president. And there was John Kerry hanging in the wind. And so it made it perfectly obvious he was going to be the next nominee for president, which he was in 2004. Okay? And so that's the way the world really works. Okay? And so what I want you to do while you're considering your thesis, I want you to just add in this perspective, that the world works differently than you've been told. And so I want you to consider taking a look at some of those other books that are on that big long list, and so that you can actually start to get a look at what the world really looks like here. So that you don't just naively say, well, I think it was the lone gunman. You still have one person here who thinks that. Or maybe it was just the CIA, because they were upset over being threatened to be busted up, you know? Or, very importantly, that you may think that it was just, in fact, the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the CIA, the FBI, and other people completely inside our government that made this decision. So as you start asking yourself, who else might have made this decision? Who is in fact in charge here? Okay? Okay. So, anyway, that's the spectrum that we have so far, up to here. You're at the 7th note of the octave. And so you're going to be wondering over the Thanksgiving holiday, I wonder what the final note is on this. And so I want you to think creatively about that. Try to figure out who it might have been that gave the green light for this to happen. Because the fact of the matter is, no matter what else you want to say about the Joint Chiefs of Staff, these are men of a certain honor that do what they're told, for the most part. These are men that are used to the chain of command. And the question is who is in charge here? Who is it that's making these kind of decisions? They would go so far as to authorize the murder in broad daylight of the President of the United States in this slaughter that took place in Dealey Plaza, where he could have been poisoned in his bed. He could have died in a swimming pool of a heart attack with some intern. You know, there are 100 different ways that the President of the United States could have been killed. But to have him in a deadly crossfire in downtown Dallas in broad daylight in the fall is a special message. Okay? And I want you to think about that. I want you to think about that while you're preparing your final papers. Okay? So now we can take a break. So just tell me what you want to know.
On Tuesday, you said you were going to talk about what Dulles' stuff that you didn't mention.
What happened is I realized as I was getting ready to prepare the lecture for today that we had to really come back and get things in context with the Joint Chiefs of Staff and the CIA and the non-CIA institutional players that may well have been or are purported to be involved in this, according to Prouty and others. So I wanted to get that out. What I'm trying to calibrate now, given the fact that only about half of the folks are going to be here for Tuesday, how deeply to go into any of this other stuff. But we'll see how that goes. And but Dulles is coming. Yeah, Dulles will be here in spades. Yes, Chris.
Why don't we have control of our government? In other words, why don't we vote out politicians?
Well, okay. There's at least 2, possibly 3 different levels to the answer to that.
Because I have an idea, and I haven't had it proved wrong, or there's a better one out there. I don't know if it...
Yeah. Well, I think I told you guys the story about Peter Rodino, didn't I? When I went over to see Scott Armstrong. Does that ring any bell? Well, let me start and throw your hands up in the air if I've told you this. That when I was getting ready to file the complaint in the Ron Hoskin case, I had the whole draft of it all done, and I went over to see Scott Armstrong. Scott is the guy that I mentioned, who is the guy who interviewed Alexander Butterfield and found out about the fact that the White House Oval Office had a taping system in it with Nixon. And so Scott Armstrong was the guy who actually found out about the taping system and became the kind of the hero of the Watergate investigation, because once they had their hands on the tapes, it told exactly what the conversations were that Nixon was having. And so I went over to see Scott Armstrong. He had left the Senate, or the House Judiciary Committee, and had become the founder and the CEO for a thing called the National Security Archives in Washington, D.C. And it was just down the street from my office at the Jesuit National Headquarters. So I went over to it, and I brought a copy of the complaint, and I gave it to him, and I said, look, here's the complaint we're getting ready to file here shortly down in Miami, and I want you to take a look through this, because you may be familiar with some documents and stuff that you have that I might be able to use to help footnote some of the things that we said here in the complaint. And so he sat down and he kind of thumbed through the complaint, and he looked at it, and he looked up at me and said, this isn't true. This stuff isn't true. And I said, well, actually it is. And he said, if this were true, I'd know about it, he said to me. And I said, well, it is true, and apparently you don't know about it. So what I propose you do is take the complaint and check with a number of your sources and get back to me in a couple days when you confirm that it's true. And so, and I left. And so a couple days later, I get a call back from him. He said, Danny, come on over, come back over. And so I went back over to the National Security Archives, and he said, quote, I'll be a son of a bitch. He said, this is true. He said, I checked with Cy Hirsch and some of the other guys that I know. And they didn't believe it at first, but they checked it out, and it's true what you're saying. He said, look, this is great. He said, what I'm going to do is I'm going to go over to see Peter Rodino, who is still the chairman of the House Judiciary Committee, that still has the exclusive jurisdiction over determining impeachments, he said. I'm going to go see him, and what we'll do is we'll get him to put together a special select committee on impeachment, and he'll make me his chief of staff. And we'll impeach these bastards, he said. So I said, fine, okay? So he goes over, and I wait for him. I wait a couple days. I don't hear anything back. And wait a couple more days. I still don't hear anything back. So I call over to the National Security Archives, and I get a hold of Tom Blanton. Tommy Blanton is his deputy. So I get a hold of Tom, and I say, Tommy, what's going on? I said, Scott was going to get back to me in a couple days, and he hasn't gotten back. He said, Dan, you got to come on over. I got to talk to you. So I come over. I go back over to the archive, and I go in to meet Tom Blanton. And Blanton sits down. He says, look, he said, Scott went over to talk to Rodino, and you know he gives Rodino the complaint. He has Rodino read through the complaint, and then he tells Rodino that he's confirmed this. The Cy Hirsch and other guys have confirmed that this is true. And he said Peter Rodino looked at Scott and he said, Scott, this is terrible. He said, my God, he said, this is awful. He said, I've been telling people for years that if they didn't like the way our American policies were going, that they should write a letter to their congressman. And he said, and I'm telling them if their congressman doesn't do anything about it, they ought to vote for somebody else for Congress. He said, but if what you're telling me here is true, why then, my God, Scott, we haven't even been in charge. I'm not going to allow the Congress of the United States to investigate anything like that. That's what he said. So what does that tell you? You know, that it's a very serious matter here. That I spent 20 years in that town, and I can tell you that you go in and talk to individual congressmen, and they live in constant fear of being attacked from the right and being accused of being soft on communism, now soft on terrorism. That there's a hardcore right wing. I'm not talking about the Tea Party, who are the kind of phonies that they throw up here, you know. You get a whole bunch of kind of people from the trailer parks, you know, and they rally them all together. The Koch brothers pay for some buses, and they bus them in and pay for their signs, and they jump up and down hollering about birth control or, you know, I don't know what else. But the fact is that doesn't mean anything. The fact of the matter is that they've known for years that there's this deep security state institution in the country. And that you get crossways with that, and your curtains politically, and so that this question that you're asking is, you know, can't you just vote for new Congress people? You know, can't you just vote for somebody else? It isn't as easy as that. The reality is that the Republican and Democratic Party have a lock on this. Well, I remember I was flying with Ross Perot. Ross gave me a call. And he said, hello, Dan. He says, Ross Perot here, he said, listen, I saw you on C-SPAN, you were testifying in front of the House Foreign Affairs Committee, and they shut off all the C-SPAN cameras, and ordered everybody out of the Congress, and tried to make you go behind closed doors. And he said, look, I gotta come and see you. He said, I've been planning to see you, so I'm gonna come in. I'm flying in to see you. He said, I graduated from the Naval Academy, you know, Dan. He said, and I'm coming in to do the Forrestal lecture at the Naval Academy, and I want you to come on over as my guest, and bring a bag, and we'll fly down to Texas, and we'll talk about this. So he flies in to do the Forrestal lecture, and I go over. You know, I'm the only guy in civvies in the whole place besides him. And so he comes down and shakes my hand, and he says, look, I gotta go stand in line to shake hands with a lot of these brass hats. And he said, but then we'll fly to Texas, and we'll talk about this. So we get in the Learjet, and we're flying down to Texas, and I lay out for him the enterprise, and the wire diagram of it, and who's in charge, and how it got started, and what they're all doing. And he's saying, why? He says, this is terrible. He says, listen, he says, who do you think we should tell about this? And so I'm saying, well, I said, I've been trying to tell people about it. And he said, you know, how about George Bush? He says, I know George. He said, technically, he said, I know George, and he's kind of like a Boy Scout in this whole thing. And I said, well, actually, you know, since Donald Gregg, who was his national security advisor, is the vice president, is the CIA case officer for Felix Rodriguez, who is running the entire Ilopango air operation for the Contras. If you really want to tell somebody who doesn't already know, you want to try somebody like the head of the FBI. You know, give a call to the head of the FBI. Who was it? Bill? Who was that?
Mueller?
No, it was not Robert Mueller. Anyway, the head of the FBI at the time, William something or other. Anyway, so I said, look, why don't you give him a call? And he said, okay. He said, what I'll do, he says, you write out the wire diagram, is a memo explaining what's all, Bill Webster, he says, and you write it all out, and I'll give Bill Webster a call. He said, you know, it's one of the advantages in being a billionaire, Dan. They'll always take your call.
But he was head of CIA, right?
No, Bill Webster was the head of the FBI at that time. He went on to be the head of the CIA.
Oh, okay, all right.
Okay,
Yeah.
and so I draft up the wire diagram, and we bring it in to Bill Webster, and Bill Webster starts the investigation, and that is in fact why the Attorney General for the Reagan-Bush administration ends up going on national television, Ed Meese, and saying, oh, gee, Faith and Begora, we've discovered this rogue colonel, Oliver North, who has gone around recruiting these old retired CIA people on the golf courses around Virginia, and has put together some kind of off-the-shelf enterprise of some sort. And we've dismissed him, and everything's going to be under control because I've asked for a special prosecutor to be appointed. And as the Attorney General, under the Special Prosecutor Act, I'll draft up the charter to designate what's going to be investigated. And what he drafted up as is saying that the investigation is going to be confined solely to the question as to whether or not Ronald Reagan personally authorized the transfer of a portion of the profits that were gained by the sale of TOW missiles to the Hezbollah to be transferred to the Contras in violation of the Boland Amendment. It's all very complicated. But the bottom line is it was an extraordinary constraint on what the actual objectives of the investigation were going to be. And it turns out that the Senate and House Select Committees that were set up to investigate the Iran-Contra scandal adopted the exact same narrow focus for their investigation. And then the United States Senate chose to head up their investigation of the Iran-Contra case, Tom Polgar. If you don't remember who he is, he's the guy that was made the CIA station chief in Mexico City by Theodore Shackley. This is the guy that sent Joseph Burkholder Smith to see the Nazis. Okay? He's the guy that ends up being in charge of the investigation of the charges that we've made in the Iran-Contra case. So you're probably at that spot right now where you're prepared to jump out of a first-story window. But it's just necessary for you to understand how little control at the present time we have over the government. And the reason for it is because of such a small amount of time that you spend doing anything about it. Now, it's okay for you guys right now because you're in school still, right? And you're working, you're learning about this stuff, you're trying to figure out what you're gonna do, what kind of career you're gonna have in your life and stuff like this. But the fact is that 99.99% of the people, after they get out of school, they don't do anything about helping on any of this stuff. They don't do anything to involve themselves in politics. They don't do anything to really find out what's really going on. They turn on the tube and they watch NBC or CNN, you know, and they basically get fed this pablum, and they just buy it. And so, or that, you know. And so what I'm saying is that it's not to be critical of ourselves. It's to understand that, like anything else, it's like being in high school and saying, gee, I'd really like to be on the cheerleading team, but I don't want to go to practice, you know? Or, you know, I really like to get to play football for my school, but gee, you know, running around and, you know, getting hit and stuff like that, I don't really want to do that. You know, and you say, well, gee, if you don't want to do anything about this, then, you know, then don't complain about it. But the fact of the matter is, you need to be inspired to complain about it. Because what's supposed to be done is in the educational system that we have. We're supposed to be trained to believe the stuff that the country is all about. That whole theory of the Constitution, the whole theory of all of us having the right to participate in the government, the right for ourselves to talk with each other and share all this information. The kind of things that I'm telling you about right now are things that you almost never find out about, you know, in any colleges or any places where you go. Because there's this kind of self-constraint that is constantly put on the people by usually the boards of education and everybody else, that they don't want to talk about this stuff. And so what I'm trying to do in this particular course, because we have this special occasion of the 50th anniversary, something that you're going to, you know, you go home tonight and you turn on the television, and within 30 minutes, if you look at the channels, you're going to see a big, long kind of deal about President Kennedy. You know, because it's the time for everybody to think about that. And you know, what you'll hear is you'll see guys like Vincent Bugliosi and the other people all getting in there spewing this stuff about how you know, it's so bad that this one lone gunman killed the president, and what a sad thing that is, about what a great and glorious guy he was, that he held out hope for everybody. You know, and it's a straight up line that you're going to get fed. You know, when I'm hoping that in this particular course, you're going to be starting to think more seriously about all of that. And you're going to see the news that comes on, and you're going to say, wait a second, I'm being fed a load here. You know? And so you'll say, oh, so that's what it looks like to be fed a load. and then you'll know that you've been getting fed a load every night on the news, and you didn't notice it. Only because you didn't know what was really true, right? And so the question that I think you're really asking, Chris, is you're asking, say, what is it that we can really do about this? And that's the exact proper question. That people who do film and media like you do, people are going to be lawyers, people are going to be reporters or journalists or teachers or something like that. What you have to do is decide whether you're going to make a commitment to actually use the particular skill sets that you're learning here at the university to actually help make things true that we were promised are going to be true. You know? And so it's some people consider it to be an existential process. You know, well, it isn't really true yet, but if you keep on working hard enough and believing that it's true, and you conduct yourself with those is true, that's going to make it true. You know, but the important thing to remember, I'll tell you a quick story. That there's a famous Greek tragedy called Antigone that Sophocles wrote. I'm sure you've all read it. But anyway, Sophocles wrote this Greek tragedy about Antigone, that she was one of the daughters of the king of Thebes, right? And the king of Thebes, who was Oedipus, had discovered this horrible thing that he was having an affair with his own mother, and he ran out and put his eyes out with a brooch and ran out into the storm and never got seen again. You remember that part. But the bottom line is that his children, he had a set of twin sons, and because the king had run off and abandoned the throne, his younger brother, Creon, had to become the regent until the time the children, who were going to be the king, became of age. There was a problem, however, because they were twins. And so the question became, is how were twins going to actually be able to rule? How could they decide which one of them was going to be the king? And so they made a decision, the city fathers all got together, and they decided that they would have them alternate, that one of them would be the king for a year, and then the other one would be a king the second year, and then they would alternate. And they would start out with the one of them that was actually born first of the twins. And so they end up having that guy become the king when he turns 18, and he serves as the king for the end of the year. And when he gets all the way down to the end of the year, he starts thinking, wait a second, I was born first, and that by the rule of primogeniture, I'm the older, and so I should be the king. And so he decided he was going to stay on as the king. And the younger of the two twins said, wait a second, we had a deal. That all the city fathers and everybody else all agreed that you were going to stand down at the end of the year, and I was going to get to be the king for the next year. And so when he goes to all the city fathers and started saying, look, what about the deal we had? They all started going, well, actually he's kind of right, and besides he's got the military on his side and he's going to fight if you try to go ahead with what we had promised. And so that, look, let's really think harder about this. The guy was born first, and so look, let's just calm down. And so the younger of the two twins goes out and stirs up the rabble. That's us. That's the rabble. He goes outside and stirs up the rabble, and they all organize and they attack the city of Thebes. And they get to the seventh gate of Thebes, the famous seventh gate of Thebes, and the two of them, the two twins, meet in hand-to-hand combat. And they end up killing each other. And so that what happens is the city fathers, they all decree, in the story of Antigone, they all decree that the older brother, who had died defending the glory and the honor of the city as the king, is going to be buried with royal honors like the Kennedy assassination burial, for example. And what they do is they put the coins in his eyes, and they put the coins in his eyes, and they put him on the golden shield, and they march him around through the city of Thebes, have this great ceremony, and they order the second brother of the twins to be left for carrion. That is, that he's to be left to rot out in front of the seventh gate of Thebes. And his sister, Antigone, the protagonist in this drama, Antigone says, oh, wait a second, I've been fated. I remember, I was fated by the Delphic oracle. At my birth, it said, you were going to die at the hands of your family for attempting to protect the honor of your brother. And I've never understood what that meant. Because I said, well, look, I don't have any problems with this. Everything was going along fine until this thing happened here. But here I am now with my brother, the twins, left for carrion out in front of the gates of Thebes. Well, now I get it. Because Creon issued this order that anyone who went out and attempted to bury this younger one of the twins, if anyone tried to bury him, they were going to be executed by being cemented into a cave and smothered. And so she's got this big famous soliloquy in Antigone where she's there going, oh gee, what a bummer, but I'm fated, so I gotta go do this. So she marches out right at high noon the next day and puts the coins in his eyes and starts throwing dirt on him. And she's captured, of course, by the military, the national security decision. She's captured by the military, and they march her into Creon, and he's feeling terrible because it turns out that she's engaged to his son, Paris. And so Paris vows that if she's going to get cemented into the cave, he's going with her. And so he does. So Creon, in order to preserve the honor of the city, he has to cement her and his son, his only son, into the cave, and they die. It's a great tragedy, like the Greeks are into. And so everybody's dead. There's the kid dead. There's the other guy dead. Here's the Paris and Antigone locked in the thing, dying there, and that's the end of the story. Okay, but what happened is in 1954, Jean Anouilh wrote another Antigone, an existentialist Antigone. And what he does is everything's exactly the same. Antigone is fated at birth of, having to be killed by her family, die at the hands of her family for trying to protect the honor of her brother. Everything goes exactly the same thing. They get all the way down to this thing. And here she is in her soliloquy with her brother laying out there rotting in front of the Seven Gate of Thieves. And she's standing under the moon and she's going, oh, this is terrible. I'm fated by the Delphic Oracle. I've got to go out tomorrow and bury him in front of everybody. And then she says, nah. Nah, I don't think I'm going to do that. I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to wait around here and wait for these soldiers to go to sleep. And I'll hang out night after night after night waiting for these guards to get tired and go to sleep. Third night, fourth night, finally they fall asleep in the middle of the night. So she sneaks out in the middle of the night and she puts the coins in his eyes and the coins in his mouth and covers him up with dirt, and then she leaves. And now, according to all the beliefs, the religious beliefs of the community, he's going to cross the river Styx, right? Like the other brother did. So she then goes back and she's happy, and the guards wake up and they go, oh shit, look at this. The guy's been buried. You know, we're screwed. So he says, look, here's what we're going to do. What we're going to do is we're going to go see Creon. So they run up to see Creon, and there's this great scene with Creon with this big full moon night, and they say, gee, Creon, we're bummed out here because somebody buried this dude, right? And so he says to him, did anybody see it? They go, well, no, nobody saw it. He said, well, look, here's what you do. You go outside and you unbury the guy, and you take the coins out of his eyes and his mouth, and you guys keep the coins. Okay? But just don't tell anybody about this, and it'll be okay. So they do that, right? So the next day, the sun rises and everything, and here's Antigone waiting for this big storm to hit, that everybody's discovered that the guy's buried. She hears nothing, right? So she's going, what's this all about? She goes out, and there he is, unburied. She goes, oh, rats. You know, so she has to wait, and she says, okay, I'm going to have to do this again. So she waits several nights again, and here finally the guys fall asleep again. She runs out, she puts the coins in his eyes and kicks dirt on him, and all of a sudden they wake up and catch her. And they snatch her up, and they drag her. She's got this big hood on in the thing. They drag her up in, and they bring her into the big moonlight chambers of Creon, her uncle, you know, in the middle of the night, and he throws back the cowl that she got, and there it is. It's Antigone. And he goes, oh, gee, Antigone, it's you doing this. Look, guys, did anybody see this happen? No, they said nobody saw it happen. Okay, good. Go back out, take the dirt off this guy, and keep the coins. Don't tell anybody about this. So he says, all right. So okay, he says, and they leave. And so he says, look, Antigone, you got to relax. You got to calm down here. You know, you're causing all this trouble. You know, you got to stop going and doing this. She said, well, look, I've been fated. I've been fated by the Delphic Oracle, you know, to die at the hands of my family to save the honor of my brother. And he says, look, come on, Antigone, look, let me tell you something. Let me tell you something. There's been a big mistake here. The fact is, your two brothers, twin brothers, met out in front of the gates of Thebes, and they had this big fight, chopped each other all up, and it was so bad that we couldn't recognize which one was the right guy. And so what we did is we picked up a guy and we put him up on the golden shield, put the coins in his eyes and mouth, and marched him around the city, and had this royal burial, and we discovered it was the wrong guy. It was the wrong twin. It was the guy that actually led the attack against the city of Thebes, and the king is laying out there rotting. He said, but the fact is, now, even according to your own beliefs, your younger brother has been buried in full proper regalia. He's going to cross the river Styx. And because your other brother died defending this honor of the city, he's already crossed the river Styx. So you don't have to do anything. She says, nah, no, I'm not going for that. Look, you're humiliating my brother, and I've been fated. I've been fated to have to die at the hands of my family to save the honor of my brother. And so I'm going to go back and do it again tomorrow. And he goes, oh, look. Okay, look. Gee, he said, let me tell you something. I've really got to share something with you, a deep secret. The way the world really works. He says, there are no gods. Your father, Oedipus, and I, and the other city father, we all made this up. We all sat down together and we all made up this story about the gods and the Delphic Oracle and everything. And so the reality is there are no gods. So you don't have to go do this. You're not really fated at all. And she looked at him and she said, oh, really? I'll show you. She says, what I'm going to do is I'm going to go out tomorrow at the high noon, and I'm going to put the coins in his eyes, and I'm going to put the dirt on him, and I'm going to bury him, and you are going to have to cement me in the wall, in the cave, and kill me. with Paris, my lover, and your son. Because we're all fated. And you guys don't even know it. Okay? What I'm saying to you is that there's a great thesis on which our country has been founded. That there's this whole natural law concept about how we are all endowed by our Creator with certain really fundamental inalienable rights. And that we have all these rights, and we've enumerated some of them in the Constitution. We've set up a Constitution in which equal rights are to be provided for all of us. And the fact of the matter is, the people who created it, a substantial portion of those people never believed that. Never believed that. Alexander Hamilton, the Hamiltonians, and a lot of those guys, the people that were the large bankers that wanted to have a big central bank and the mercantile class and all that, never believed that. They didn't believe in the revolution. They actually supported the royalists all the way from Europe. They believed that there was a certain elite that were much more entitled to actually govern, that they were more intelligent, they were harder working, they weren't the kind of great unwashed people, that it's ridiculous to have people who don't know enough how to pass a test on how to run a government be able to vote on how to run a government. The question that you asked. Okay? So that what they've been resisting this all the time. And they went along with this kind of theory, this kind of mythology about us all being endowed by their Creator with these rights, etc. But they've constantly, consistently resisted this down through the years. And there's another group of people that have been the Jeffersonians and Madison and all those people have been actually pushing and pushing for this kind of theory to be put into place. Turns out that you will discover, much to your surprise, that virtually all of these people, 4 of the original United States Supreme Court justices, 39 of the original United States senators, and 40 of the original members of Congress in the Continental Congress, that James Madison himself, the principal author of the Constitution, all of them were students of one person, a guy by the name of John Witherspoon. He was a professor at Princeton University. He taught at Princeton University from something like from 1760 on to 1789 or something like that. But he had taught all of these people in a course on moral philosophy. And he taught them about natural law. He taught them about this entire theory that the entire universe is one unified, harmonious whole. Comes right straight from Greece in the radical monists of the Stoics. It's a deep and abiding understanding inside our culture about the source of these fundamental human rights and why it is that we as individuals, because we have the capacity to be able to discern the right and the good, that entitles us all to participate. Not because we know how many independently targetable warheads happen to be on one MIRV missile, or that we know all the details about everything, but we have a way to discern what is right and what is wrong. Okay? And that because of that, we have an absolute right to participate in the decision making. But the fact of the matter is, it requires work. It requires attention. It requires a dedication and a belief in this. And one of the major problems that we have is that nobody teaches you about this. Nobody really teaches you how to understand what the fundamental source of all of these beliefs really are. Because they just pass it on to you like it's like one other subject that you're supposed to know. Oh yeah, I had to take high school civics. And you don't understand, they don't teach you about anything. And one of the major problems, one of the reasons for that, is just as was pointed out by what was his name, the German philosopher that was the guy that came up with biodynamic gardening, Rudolf Steiner. Rudolf Steiner said it. He said, look, the one most serious problem is to have the state be in charge of your education. If you put the state in charge of your education, those who run the state will teach you to understand it the way that it is beneficial to them. And virtually all of us are the product of state-sponsored education. And because of that, you get spoon-fed a whole set of beliefs that turn out that by the time you get to be 18 to 21 years old, you come out into the real world and you say, oh gee, it doesn't seem to be working like that. And so what you do is you give up on it. And you go and you spend your life, getting and spending and laying waste your power with all others, in working for some company and making money and buying a color television set and, new BMW, and that's what you're caught in. And what you really need to understand is that you are part of a specific culture, a Western civilization culture that has different forces competing with each other to try to get you to understand reality. Thus, the early lectures that we had about the different worldviews that I was talking to you about. Because the way that you answer some of these fundamental questions about cosmology, how the universe came into being, whether the universe is actually unfolding in some intelligent way, that is moving towards some meaningful end, and therefore we as a human species have some kind of role to play in a meaningful unfolding of the universe towards some type of teleological objective, and whether consciousness that we all experience is just some kind of minor epiphenomenon of the interplay between mass and energy, or whether it's something else. But these are profound and fundamental questions that you don't usually get to deal with, because they don't talk to you about this. And what I'm trying to convey to you in this particular class is that when we find something that's as important as is going to be on television every night for the next week when you go home and look at it, and it's at the central core of our entire cultural dialogue that's going on, and you know that you're being fed a load by these media. The fact of the matter is, I'm trying to assist you in figuring out how to cope with that, how to come to grips with that, so that this one course that you have in the course of your 4 years here, that will cause you to say, wait, I remember that there is a more serious way to approach things, that I can find out more than is just given to me on the television. I can find out more than is just spoon-fed to me in the courses that I've got to take in order to achieve my major, so I can get a better job. There are things that you can find out if you really want to, and you have time still. Most of you have time still here at the university, where you can actually dig in and start finding these kind of things out. You can ask these kind of questions. You can write papers about things that really make a difference, and that's what we're talking about. And what you need to start, Chris, and all of you in response to your question, you have to start doing that. You have to start wanting to do something. Don't give up on our country, and don't give up on the Constitution. Don't give up on the basic beliefs in what has to do with human rights, because these people killed Kennedy for this. That's what happened here. Not because he was some moral degenerate, not because he happened to, not be able to keep his pants on around, women, but because he had shifted his position. He had shifted over on that night, on October 26th of 1962, when the entire established order had decided that we ought to go and bomb the shit out of Cuba. Just because they, in fact, were going to have diplomatic relations with the Soviet Union and China, and that they weren't going to be able to stand that. So what I'm saying is that we are confronted by a group of people who have a particular set of beliefs, who are adherents to a particular worldview, that are the adherents to the second paradigm worldview of dialectical materialism. And make no mistake about it, that both the ardent capitalists and the ardent communists are both adherents to that exact same worldview.
That's right.
That they are in direct confrontation with each other because, pursuant to Hegel's beliefs and Kant's beliefs, they have become convinced that there is no way for a human being to actually get access to the truth. that all you have is your thesis about the truth, and another person has an antithesis, and the fact is they'll struggle together and generate a synthesis between the two, which becomes a new operating theory. It's the classic Hegelian dialectic. And that they believe that the only way to measure any values is in the material world, is material benefits in food and other things, that in buildings and cars. And what I'm saying is that there's another view. There's another view. In fact, there are 7 other views. Other than that one second paradigm dialectical materialistically grounded view of the struggle of that kind. And so I don't want to suggest that you get caught in a dialectic thinking that they're the bad guys and we're the good guys. Because I can tell you, if you get caught in that dialectic, that's their game. They have more guns, they have more tanks, they have more armor, they have more nuclear weapons than we do. Okay? So what we have to do is what I'm calling you out to do is to find out what it is that underlies the basic moral beliefs in democracy, in moral beliefs in egalitarianism, in moral beliefs in a fair sharing of the resources of the world. Well, we all sit around and we start, wringing our hands. They're having the major session, the 19th session about global warming, over in Warsaw right now. And they're all sitting there wringing their hands because the United States and China and the other ones don't have the slightest interest in stopping pumping this bilge out into the environment. And the United States Congress, run by the Democrats and Republicans, passed a clean air bill. The clean air bill just authorizes all these corporations to pump thousands of tons of this stuff into the atmosphere. So we have to gain control of our country. We have to gain control of our government. But to do so, you have to, in my opinion, you have to come to understand what the basic reasons are why we, in fact, are each of absolute value. And why it is that we have not only the right, but the duty, the obligation to speak out and to organize. Not wait for somebody else to do it for us. Not to simply settle on, maybe if we vote for somebody else for Congress, or even somebody else for the president, that somehow it'll all change. That isn't going to happen. That isn't going to happen. Because you're going to find yourself confronted, as I started talking with you about in the very first class, you're going to find yourself confronted with this massive global climate change that is in the process of happening right now. We got the biggest storm in the entire history of human civilization has just hit the Philippines. And we've got massive tornadoes hitting in Illinois, wiping out entire places like an atom bomb has hit them. And we've still got these people in the right-wing group of the dialecticians saying they don't believe that global climate change is really happening. They're actually watching the polar ice caps melt away in front of us. And they're maintaining that it isn't true. Okay? And what we're doing is that you are being prepared right now. You have the opportunity to be prepared in the years that you spend at university, not just in your undergraduate years, but in graduate studies, to learn what to do about this. How do you deal with people like this? How do you deal with people in the other worldviews? What worldview do you actually adhere to? That you should, when you come out of your educational experience with undergraduate and graduate work, you should have a very clear idea which of these worldviews you actually adhere to, so that you can make consistent decisions. And you can organize people who agree with you to effectuate those decisions in the public realm. That's what you've got to do. And what I'm saying to you is that if you care about what happened to President Kennedy, and you care about what happened to our country at that time, that you will, in fact, do more work than you had intended to before you took this class. You will, in fact, read more, you will find out more, you will go to more meetings, you will organize more, and you will play a much greater role in finding out what happened in this country, and finding about what's going to happen, rather than electing another congressperson or a different person, and finding that you're inside a congressional district that's been totally gerrymandered, and that it doesn't make any difference, who one or another party nominates, because the other party is going to win. because they totally gerrymandered the whole district so that like 60% of the people, like, you know, can you imagine being a Republican in this town? You know, I guess there's some of them, you know, but the fact of the matter is, what good does them do? Oh, I wish we could elect our congressperson, you know? I mean, they're not gonna elect a Republican congressperson in Santa Cruz County, you know, because the Democrats have it totally controlled. And there are other congressional districts around the country that are just exactly like that for Republicans. And so, what they've done is they've divided the country up. There's a whole lot of things that you need to find out about. What I'm hoping to do is to be able to share just some of these things in the direct context of the assassination of the president, which in fact is one of the most emotionally troublesome things that happened during our entire watch. The rest of the people here in the back half of the room. That this is the most traumatic thing one of the most traumatic things that ever happened to us. And it's still having repercussions still to this day. And so that what I'm saying to you is that when you ask me, I'm delighted that you asked me, Chris, is that what is it we can do? You know, can we elect another congresspeople? Can we organize another political party? You know, what can we do? What I'm saying is that the answer to that is one hell of a lot more than you ever intended to do. One hell of a lot more than you intended to do. Because I hope that this class will convince you that there's things going on in the world that you didn't know about, and that you can, in fact, do something about it. Every single one of you here, and you may not believe this, but every single one of you is capable of doing at least as much as I have done. Absolutely true. Absolutely true. People, oh, well, you got to go to Harvard College and Harvard Law School. You know, you've gotten to go to UC Santa Cruz.
Yay.
You know, look at all the other people who couldn't have gotten here. Couldn't have gotten here. You know, that they were born into families that didn't have any funds at all. They're born in ghettos, periods where they can't do anything. You guys have been given an opportunity to do this. Okay? And what I'm saying is whether you become lawyers or whether you become journalists or whether you become doctors or whatever it is you become, the fact of the matter is if you are willing to do one hell of a lot more work than you ever intended to do when you took this class, you can in fact do as much as I've ever done. And it's true. It's true that you can do that. You know? And so that, you know, I've been given the opportunity to teach this particular class. And so as you might have guessed, I've decided to lay it out for you guys. You know, it doesn't mean that I'll necessarily be invited back, you know, but the fact of the matter is that you have the ability to insist upon having people such as me or others get to come and actually talk with you about the way the world really is and what it is you can do about it. And that you'll learn in other classes what other things you can do about it. You will take classes that will help you learn what to do about this. And, you know, and I'm always available, you know, over at the Galleria. And people can just call me. You've all got my phone number there. If you know, it's 459-6136. You know, just, you can call me, and I'm perfectly happy to counsel you, advise you, write letters of recommendation for you, for your graduate school, for other things you want to do, you know. In that I want you to become serious students of studying our culture and our values and our history and the fundamental values that underlie our Constitution and our country that do in fact indeed make us potentially special and being able to share these values with other people around the world. Not through military hardware and economic domination of them, but through the espousal of these beliefs so that we can take these people who are in charge of the country still to this day and turn them out of office and put people in who care about other people and to roll back this military and to disarm these nuclear weapons. The very kinds of things that Kennedy himself had decided he was going to do after that night of October 26th, when he stared into the maw of total destruction of the human family. And he turned away from that and was a changed person. And he was going to take the steps that he knew that he should take from that point on. And that's why he was killed. Okay? So that's the answer to your question, Chris. Okay, Greg.
Well, with respect to what you just said and Chris's question, a couple of things. First, in Kennedy's inaugural, he laid out this whole natural law versus people just being subject to the generosity of the state. Where in fact, he said, if you don't believe in the divine right, basically, of man, you are subject to just the generosity of the state for what's gonna happen to you. And after the Cuban Missile Crisis, when somebody would ask him directly, personal friends, whatever it was, and this is in James Douglas's book, you know, what the hell happened to you, basically, he said, you believe in redemption, don't you? That was just an exact quote that he used over and over again with people. The other aspect of this, with respect to the politicians, every single one of the congressional people out there, Senate, Congress, once they sign on the dotted line with the CIA or anybody that shows them that information that they get in some secret committee, they're subject to the same laws as everybody else. They'll get thrown into Leavenworth if they open their mouth about it. So they've got that hanging over them. The second thing, at the time that Kennedy was in office and you went into public service, you took the salary you got and you divested yourself of all your stocks and all the rest of the crap that you had out there because you weren't allowed to play the insider trading game. And now we know that you go into Congress now and you've been given an open ticket, in effect, to sit on a committee meeting, find out insider information, and go, in effect, all in like you're playing, you know, poker or something like that on a bet in the stock market so these guys get rich. Okay, the other thing is, I've been in software since 1981, and I've sold software to the CIA, to the DIA, to the government printing office, to the Census Bureau, to the patent office. All these guys, every single deal I ever did required a source code escrow with the government, every single time. So, and what that means is they can go take a look at the core code that was meant to be written, understand it completely inside and out, in case the company goes bankrupt or something goes wrong or there's a fraud case. Soon as the voting machines came out, the very first ones, and once I found out that that was declared proprietary software and there were no source code escrows, there was absolutely no reason to believe in hacking as being a cause of vote fixing. It's been fixed from inside out in those machines because we can't ever look in at it. No government agency, anybody. They got a special pass for that. And as far as I can tell from looking at it and other software engineers I've talked to, and this has come up a number of times over and over again, they so far don't have the algorithms fixed well enough to change much more than a really close election. They haven't got it completely wired in yet. Yet the difference between the 2000 election, 2004, and 2008 is that there's some software that's in the relay stations where they put all the vote counts in now that's been gamed. But it will take probably until the 2020 election in order for them to be able to wire these things completely. But one thing they can't beat, and they haven't been able to beat all along if you take a look at this, is a landslide. So vote is my suggestion to you, regardless of vote for the lesser of the two evils, vote for a third party, but it is about the last thing that you actually do have. So don't despair, fight for who you want and vote. That's basically it.
Yes, Chris, you got a follow-up?
I was gonna explain my theory as a
Okay, and then I'll do Wes and we'll keep going. Yeah, go ahead, Chris.
theory on what the cancer is that is what I call apathy. And is it Amigo de Cabrillo and their son Yankee?
Which?
She's a history teacher, and I failed U.S. history 3 and 4 times, split classes before and after I went in the Navy. And I think this lecture today sort of explains why I'm just not believing the stuff that's coming out of there. And I was able to pass when I took it in tandem with ecology, understanding things of nature. Well, this teacher also put forth this idea that I thought I'd never heard before, that the Bill of Rights could possibly be a reason for voter apathy. To think, well, the government can't screw with this, so I can rest easy. Nothing they can do can screw with that because it's in stone. There's a Bill of Rights. I was wondering if you had anything.
Well, it is true. It is true that the way that the Constitution is taught in state-sponsored high schools and colleges around the country, that they actually give you the impression that these rights that have been set forth in the Constitution were actually decided upon by this group of ruling founding fathers. They were part of the mercantile class and the others, in that they sort of basically gave these rights to the people. and that therefore they're giving these rights to the people, and the people have to responsibly exercise them. But the fact of the matter is, these other ruling class people are going to do the government. And that you just get to vote on them once every 4 years or 2 years, but they'll handle the governing for you. And that if you have this Bill of Rights, that you're basically protected. The reality is that when you have the National Security, the National Defense Authorization Act or something like that passed in 2011, you can't exercise that kind of fantasy any longer. You know, when we have a federal statute that expressly authorizes the military to come and pick you up, I've talked about this before, come and pick you up without any probable cause to believe that you've committed any crime whatsoever, and incarcerate you in a military stockade, you know, without any notice to your family that you've been taken, without any right to appear in front of a magistrate within 48 hours, which is the fundamental promise of the right of habeas corpus, which is at the core of the founding of the Constitution. And not only not allow you to be given an attorney to protect you, but in fact, even if you have an attorney, they won't let the attorney near you. And that they will put you in front of a military tribunal without telling you what the charges are, without allowing you to cross-examine the witnesses, without even knowing what the evidence is against you, and then convict you with less than a unanimous decision on the part of the military tribunal, and put you in military prison, open-endedly. Now, what I'm saying is that the reason that the National Defense Authorization Act is so important for us to concentrate on here is because it is a virtual public total stripping of our citizens of the most fundamental basic rights that are guaranteed to us in the Constitution. But remember, while they may be guaranteed to us in the Constitution, it doesn't mean that the Constitution is the source of those rights. The source of those rights comes from somewhere else. And we'll talk about that before the end of the course. But I hear what you're saying about your theory about that, and we'll talk about that, okay? Well, Wes, you had a question, and I know there's a bunch of other questions.
Yeah, tell me if I'm going too far off the deep end. I've been listening to KKUP with Dave Emery.
Oh, Dave, I know.
Yeah, and he's been delving into, I can't follow it because he's too dense on the radio, but the fifth right, is this too far along? Can you help me?
We'll get to that later.
Okay.
Yeah, we will get there
Okay.
about this, okay? So I know that, okay, so let's focus with the kids here on what your questions are about this, because I know that the long-time learners will be jumping up and down here, but, yes.
So, the CIA has connections to the Nazi Third Reich. Does the Federal Reserve, do they have like connections to the Third Reich as well?
Well, let me put it this way. When World War I was completed, this is the Wonder Bread presentation that we all get in high school and college. At the end of World War I, they had the Versailles Treaty, when Wilson was president. They had the Versailles Treaty, and in the Versailles Treaty, they negotiated a settlement, an end of World War I, and reparations were imposed against the German government for having undertaken an aggressive war against the other people in Europe. And so therefore, they were fined, and they had to pay back reparations to the other countries. And when in fact the decision was made they were going to pay reparations, they had to end up taking loans to pay those back. And it turns out that the loans were given to them by the financiers, American financiers, who were all investment clients of Brown Brothers Harriman, a particular investment firm. And their law firm that represented Brown Brothers Harriman was Sullivan and Cromwell. And the lawyers for Sullivan and Cromwell were, in fact, John Foster Dulles and Allen Dulles. You'd wondered when we were going to get to Allen. And the fact of the matter is that it turns out Allen Dulles and John Foster Dulles were at the Versailles Treaty negotiations. Because it turns out that the Secretary of State, under Wilson, was their uncle. And that he'd invited both of them to come there. And they participated in drafting up the settlement that required reparations from Germany, and then they were both appointed to be the lawyers for Germany. In actually negotiating the money that was going to be paid to cover the reparations, which was coming from their clients, who were the financial investors in Brown Brothers Harriman. And so that the money went to, in loans to Germany, and they paid the money back regular to the same people that had loaned them the money, okay? And the lawyers were the same lawyers for both parties, and they were the Dulles brothers, okay? And so that was at that particular time. So the question that you have then about the Third Reich is, well, what happened after World War I? How is it that the German government generated the Third Reich? And what happened was that the same financiers who were part of Brown Brothers Harriman, J.P. Morgan, John D. Rockefeller, later David Rockefeller, his son, turns out that the CEO of Brown Brothers Harriman was George Herbert Walker. Your eyes should be getting big at this point, because George Herbert Walker is the grandfather of George Herbert Walker Bush. That's what George H.W. Bush stands for, George Herbert Walker Bush.
So Kennedy's executive order was a no-no?
That, well, yes, but the bottom line is that these financiers, what they did is they ended up setting up a bank called the Union Bank of New York, and they put deposits into that, which were then transferred to a local branch office of the Union Bank of New York that was set up in the Netherlands, run by a fellow named Fritz Thyman. And they actually then extended the money to Adolf Hitler, that actually created the Third Reich in Germany as the bulwark against Bolshevism in Europe. Because this is the same group, these financiers are the same group that when the Bolsheviks overthrew the Tsar in 1917, at the very end of World War I that we're talking about, they actually instigated the sending of a foreign military expeditionary force from the United States into Russia to try to crush the Bolshevik Revolution. So right from the very beginning, these people saw that as a major threat to their economic and colonial hegemony in the world. So that this issue of them being the financial key to all of this, these are the same people that established the Federal Reserve Bank and the Federal Reserve System. Okay, a meeting at Jekyll Island, you know, right there at the end of World War I, and they set up the Federal Reserve. What I'm saying to you is you need to understand that the people that we're talking about get up and put their pants on one leg at a time, just like everybody else. You can find these people, you can identify these people, you can track what it is that they've done, and you can look at this if you are a serious student of history, okay? And what you're getting right now at the undergraduate level is you're getting kind of, in high school, you basically learn to read and write. And you learn to do some basic thinking, but it's mainly memorization of what you're told. You know, there's not a lot of real creative thinking going on there. And then you come to the college level, and they begin to teach you how to begin to think a little bit more independently. But it's not until you get to graduate school that you basically can dig down. You're learning right now the 1 mile wide and 1 foot deep of history. But the fact of the matter is that if you drill down on a very particular piece of history, like we're doing in this particular class, we're drilling down on this really particular piece of history surrounding the assassination of the president. If you drill down, you start to discover these things that are going on here. And that these particular individuals are the people who were the progeny of the robber barons. The robber barons it's interesting because it's come to be an accepted understanding of American history that there was this period of time between 1868 at the end of the Civil War all the way to 1898, a 30-year period. Remember, that's a 30-year period, which was basically the same amount of time back when Ronald Reagan got elected. You know, we're talking about a comparatively short period of time, a 30-year period in American history from 1868 to 1898, when the robber barons ascended to complete dominance and control in the United States. They owned the Congress, they owned the senators, they owned the railroads, they owned the oil companies. They owned all the monopolies. They basically ran everything. Okay, and it came to a head in 1898 with the taking of Cuba in the Spanish-American War. And so that these people, they took the Philippines, they took Hawaii, and the fact of the matter is that was supervised and overseen by John W. Foster, who was the Secretary of State under Harriman in 1893. That whole period of taking over those countries, John W. Foster was the grandfather of John Foster Dulles and Allen Dulles. And it was his son-in-law, married to John W. Foster's oldest daughter, Robert Lansing, who was the Secretary of State under Wilson at the Treaty of Versailles. And he's the one that brought his nephews, Allen Dulles and John Foster Dulles, to the Treaty of Versailles, helped negotiate the reparations, made them be the lawyers for the German government, and they were also the lawyers for Brown Brothers Harriman. So what I'm saying is that this is not some kind of strange conspiracy theory. This is just a simple matter of history, if you look at it. And that this is an extraordinarily powerful group of people. And that they've come all the way from the era of the robber barons, all the way up into the period at the end of the 19th century. And they all came right on into the 20th century. And that what we're seeing in the assassination of President Kennedy, we're seeing all of this coming to roost. Where we have a president that not only decides, as you know, not only decides that he's going to open up the back channel negotiations with Khrushchev and eliminate the thermonuclear weapon system, but he's going to reach out to Castro and allow him to stay in power, opening up the avenue of potential socialism and stuff in South America, and in fact issues Executive Order 1111, which actually establishes an alternative currency to the Federal Reserve. The U.S. banknote. He actually issues an executive order on June 5th of 1963, directing the printing of billions of dollars of new U.S. government banknotes, which are completely different than the Federal Reserve, which is owned and controlled by the same bankers that, in fact, are the clients of Brown Brothers Harriman. So that what you're dealing with very powerful forces that assume that you aren't paying enough attention to really recognize what it is that they're doing. Because you can be bought off. You can be bought off by them who our whole country constitutes 6% of the human family on the planet, and we consume something like 51 to 52% of all the natural resources on the entire planet every calendar year. And so what they do is they figure out if they can siphon that stuff into the maw of our economy, they can distribute enough of it down to you guys so that you are more attentive to getting your share of it than paying attention to what's going on. And that's what's happening here. Okay? So the answer is yes, that these are the same people that created the Federal Reserve, and these are the same people that created the Third Reich. They're the same people that, in fact, were the robber barons, you know, who are, in fact, adherents to the second paradigm worldview. You know, that they are dominating, that they're a white Caucasian race who believe that they're in this dialectical struggle against all of the Aboriginal people of the world. And that's how they see reality. And so that they're under constant threat, they're under siege by all of the Aboriginal people of color of the world. And so that they've got to arm themselves and build the biggest military in history, you know, and actually even conscript members of the minority to fight, you know, against their own people. And that's what's going on here. And President Kennedy got the flash of insight, you know, on that night of October 26th, as to what the full implications of this really were. And that he was getting ready to undo that. He was going to back out of this particular deal. And that he was going to disassemble the nuclear arsenal, was going to retrench from the extended imperium that the United States had asserted as a major power in the world, and was going to retrench. And these other people, these military people, these people in the CIA and the other people, these people, it was their job to preserve that. You know, they aren't the ones that created it. They're not the ones that were instigating it. These people were loyal to the system that put them in place. And they believed in what they were doing. And when they saw that this guy was out of control, and literally no longer under control, they had all these different reasons for wanting to eliminate him. But I can assure you, there wasn't a chance in the world that they would have done that without being authorized from above. And so you're at the question that we're going to look at when we come back is, who's up there? Yeah. Who is that upstairs when these decisions are being made? Who's in charge here? And what are their interests?
Danny?
Yes.
Okay, so the other asterisk on this, as far as the historical note goes, the lawyer on the American side representing Bethlehem Steel and the rest of them, looking for war reparations, was John J. McCloy,
Yes.
who was also in Germany at the same time.
He was
And
made
in
governor general.
1936, he sat in Hitler's booth
At
at
the
the
Olympics.
Olympics as well.
That's right.
He went on to become High Commissioner of Germany. He went on to become CEO of Chase Manhattan, or,
That's right.
yeah, bank.
And so we're
And chairman of the Council on Foreign Relations before he was a Warren Commission member. And he's the guy in '52 that let the rest of the Nazis out.
That's right.
Gave them back their money and let them all again run for political office and be functionaries in the government.
That's right.
Just as an extra bullet point.
Just
And the other one
as an extra
going
point.
back to the Civil War is every single one of the robber barons, every single one, including Rockefeller, Morgan, the rest of them, consolidated their money running arms during the Civil War. Regardless of whether they made their money on oil or what they did before then, they made fortunes in buying guns, even from the government, at cheap prices and selling them back to them at inflated prices.
Yeah.
So that's documented stuff.
But look at, I raise all of this at this point in the course. As I said, not to cause you to despair, because take my word for it. You know, by the time we get to the end of the course, that I'm going to explain to you why it is that I remain optimistic, why I believe that our generation and your generation can work together to turn this thing around, to not allow this thing to continue the way that it is now. You know, where we have hundreds of thousands of troops, you know, occupying the Middle Eastern oil fields, you know, and trying to hold these oil fields away from China, and to try to continue having the continued privileged access to the strategic raw materials that are needed by the members of the Northern Industrial Alliance. That may sound like a quote to you, because it is. And it comes from the second draft of the 1992 United States Defense Department Policy Planning Guidance document, which was drafted up by George Herbert Walker Bush and Theodore Shackley. Okay, just so you'll know. But we're going to cover this stuff by the time we get to the end of this course. Okay, so I don't want to accelerate it too much. Well, there we are. We are at 7 o'clock now, so what I want to do is I want to be able to give you guys a few more minutes before we leave at about 7:10. If there's any more questions from the students, and I'm sure there are. Okay? Even though I think we've driven the lady from the Sentinel out of here by this time. She probably realized, because I can't write any of this stuff anyhow, so I better get back to my shop. Okay, so what other questions do we have now that the roof has been taken off, and we're basically blue skying it here?
Can you talk a little bit more about Bobby Kennedy's assassination? Because now that you said all of this, like, it makes me think like it was the same people.
Yeah, that was the question you asked in the second class.
But now it's
No,
like,
that's right.
It's a lot more clear now.
That's right. That's right. And I reiterate that you need to take a look at James Braden. That James Braden is the fellow who was arrested coming out of the Dow Tex building, immediately next door to the to the Dallas Book Depository,
Daltex,
the Deltex building.
right,
And so he-
DALTEX.
He was arrested coming out of the Deltex building, and he was in fact picked up outside of the hotel in Los Angeles when Bobby Kennedy was assassinated, okay? And so it's you wanna follow that and take a look at it.
Well, the other aspect of it is that there were more bullets found in people and walls than Sirhan had
Had
in
his gun.
his gun.
Yeah.
Did Sirhan
So-
have relations with like any government agency?
Well, there's a lot of very interesting stuff that has been written about Sirhan, having to do with MK Ultra and other things. And I'll chat with you about that, okay? Okay, we'll do that. Now, as I know that the longtime learners are gonna be jumping up, I wanna ask some more questions. We can spend a little time after class here with the folks. I know you wanna talk about it, but I wanna make sure that I've addressed, because I've said a lot of things here today which are kind of a little different than normal for you in classes. And so I wanna make sure that whatever's stirred up, I address.
So basically, just kind of the gist that I'm getting from the conversation that we've had tonight is that the real issue with the power structures in place is the people in there. They're corrupt people who are bending the apparatus towards their will. Maybe that's a bit of an overstatement of what's going on, but essentially it's people bending the apparatus to serve their needs. But is that because the people who are in power are corrupt, or is it just that the structures of power inherently lend themselves to corruption? Is that something that can be fixed?
That's an interesting question. That these sources of injustice are structural. That they've been designed over a long period of time. And in fact, the question that you asked about the Federal Reserve System, is a type of structure. But the fact is that it only came into being like in 1913. It wasn't around forever, except that Alexander Hamilton, at the very time of the founding of the country and the founding of the Constitution and the drafting of it, Alexander Hamilton was a lawyer representing the mercantile interests in the financial world. They were constantly pressing toward establishing a central bank that they wanted to have to create money that the mercantile class could use. And so that these people are constantly engaged in an effort to make things function for their benefit, constantly. And so that when the structures end up functioning for their benefit, it's not coincidental. It doesn't just happen. That they're constantly engaged in trying to make that happen. And they view that as perfectly normal. Why wouldn't you do that? Because they don't in fact believe in the actual natural law philosophy that gives rights to everyone equally. They don't believe in that. And so that what they're doing is they're constantly engaged in this existential struggle from their side. And remember, they're dialecticians. Their fundamental worldview is one of dialectical materialism. And I'll just be closing, I'll just point out, remember that the belief systems, the fundamental belief systems that I talked about at the very beginning, the four basic pillar beliefs that go into making up a worldview, you remember that the cosmology and the teleology were two of the major fundamental beliefs that go into making up a person's worldview. And these people, the people who are adherents to the second paradigm worldview, believe, and just so this will get a little spacey here, but they believe that our universe actually is expanding out and away from the central event of the Big Bang, and every single element in the entire periodic table is disintegrating into its constituent parts. And every one of those is in turn disintegrating into its constituent parts, and at the same time expanding out and away from the locus of the Big Bang, and that this is continuing all the way out into a point where every single ultimately irreducible integer of matter in the entire universe will be separate and apart from every other one. every inchoate quantum field in the universe. But unlike the adherents to the first paradigm worldview on the extreme right, who believe that the universe will disperse entirely and disintegrate into nothingness, no thingness, adherents to the dialectical worldview believe that at the point where every single ultimately irreducible integer of matter in the entire universe stands separate and apart from every other one, the bonding attraction that every single one of them have for every other one will, in fact, when the impetus that has been imposed upon those with the Big Bang has exhausted itself, there will be a point where the universe stops and stands in a state of stasis, with every single ultimately irreducible integer of matter standing separate and apart from every other one. And at that point, the attraction that every other one of them has for every one will start to cause them to collapse back in upon themselves, and will reconstitute electrons and neutrons and protons and muons, etc. And they'll start to reconfigure and end up building elements again, and end up building compounds, and end up building star systems and planets, and that they will actually, in the compression stage, will reconfigure the material universe. And it will all continue to be drawn down into a final point where every single ultimately irreducible integer of matter in the entire universe is in direct physical contact with every other one. And that is that thing that you've heard about of, gee, they think the universe at one time was as small as the end of your thumb. And you've all heard it. You've all heard it and say, what the hell does that mean? You know, what these people believe is at that particular point, the polarity of every single one of the integers of matter will reverse itself and repel every other one and generate another Big Bang. And that the dialectical materialists believe that there is this perpetual oscillation of the universe between an ultimate state of energy and an ultimate state of mass, and that is what the universe is. They call it the magnum annus, the great year of the expansion and contraction of the universe, and that they believe that that's what's going on, and they believe that therefore the only referent for right and wrong is your being on one side of the dialectic or another. And that therefore they're constantly into figuring out who the other guy is. That they derive their entire sense of value and their entire motivation by vanquishing the ultimate other. And that is why fascism is constantly identifying communists and others as their ultimate enemy. And yet that isn't, that they're really bent upon domination, because they intend to ultimately vanquish the ultimate other and be in total control. And yet they know that there's this endless oscillation going on. And so they're endlessly committed to combat, and endlessly committed to struggle, and endlessly committed to attempting to vanquish and control the world. That's what's really going on with these people. And these are the adherents to the dialectical materialist worldview. Okay? And they're both communists and capitalists. And that's why the credo of the communists are that the revolution will not be won until the last capitalist is hung on the intestines of the last liberal. Okay? Know what you're dealing with. Know what you're dealing with when you are dealing with ardent, atheistic, secular communists. Make no doubt about it, that it's not a mistake that they degenerated into what they did in the Soviet Union. Okay? But on the other hand, make no doubt, have no doubt about what you're dealing with when you're dealing with an ardent state capitalist. You know, they are dedicated to taking control and seizing control of the tools of the state to generate wealth and power and privilege for themselves. Okay? And so the adherents to this particular worldview are the ones that threaten to totally destroy us on the night of October 26th of 1962. That they were both committed to totally destroying the world in order to vanquish the alternative other. Okay? And that's what faced Kennedy that night, when he stared into the abyss and saw what the ultimate result was of that dialectical conflict. And he resolved to back out of it. And he returned to a belief in the basic unitive phenomenon that underlies the natural law worldview. And that's what he began to talk about. And that's what he talked about at Washington, at American University. And that's what he began to do. And make no doubt about him being a absolute enemy at that time of the adherence to the national security state. Because he was. And it was the perfectly logical thing for them to eliminate him. Okay, it's 7:10. I'll see half of you on Tuesday.